No, seguro que sí. No lhe pode expor 5 minutos da não. Falei, parceiro, dá uma instrução. Falei pra ele, dá uma instrução, é parceiro. Mano,
All right, let's go ahead and get started today. We'll start with the reading quiz for this week. I will say for next week, there's several chapters of reading, so you will probably want to make sure to be keeping up with that and make it a little easier with the quiz. All right, so you have 7 minutes to complete. right, there's about 1 minute left. All right. I want to just say a couple things about the exam, and then we'll get into the material for today. The exams are graded. The grades are available on Canvas under the gradebook. Overall, like for the entire class, I thought it looked pretty good. Certainly, there are probably some of you that are not satisfied with your grade. So, you know, I would encourage you to not get discouraged. Right, this one grade is not going to destroy your semester. Right? There's still plenty of opportunity to get your grades up. With that, if you did not do as well on this exam as you would have liked, I would encourage you to feel free to come talk to me about what opportunities there are for you to improve. I would encourage you to, you know, maybe pay closer attention during class, take more notes, review the Echo 360 recordings to see if there's anything that you missed. Make sure you're getting the notes into your Bible, right? Anything that's written in your Bible, you can use, right? And so I think for some of you, perhaps one area that may have got you was the video lecture. I'm wondering if it's possible for some of you, maybe you didn't take notes in your Bible during that. You know, so think about you know, what opportunities are available for you to improve your grade. But by all means, feel free to come talk to me. I'm more than willing to discuss with you, you know, what opportunities you have to improve. But overall, as far as the entire class goes, I thought it was I thought the grades were pretty good. Waiting on a couple of makeups, and so once those are done, then I'll hand the grades. I'll hand the exams back to you for you to see what you got wrong, what you didn't get wrong, what you got right. The material for the second exam does not include any of the material in the first exam, right? So you won't need to know that. The final does have a comprehensive part, but the comprehensive part is based off of verses used in the first section. So I won't be asking you questions about, you know, how do we know we have the right books of the Bible, things like that. So that material won't come up again on an exam, but you might be asked questions about some of the verses you had to read, you know, some of the things. And again, you'd be able to use your Bible and, you know, refer to that as we go through. What questions do you have? I mean, obviously general questions about the first exam. Anything that I can help you with? The other thing is that on Canvas as well, I have a column that gives you your current grade, what your current grade is in the class on an A through F scale. I would encourage you to be careful about looking at the percentage that Canvas comes up with, right? Because sometimes that's off. So look at that current grade column. That'll tell you where you stand in the class, and I'll update that, as we go through when we have, exams, as opposed to, necessarily every day. All right. Well, as I said, if there are any questions or you think of questions later, feel free to send me an email, come by during office hours, catch me before or after class, whatever I can do to help you improve for the next exam. But again, if you did not do as well on this first exam as you would have liked, it's not going to destroy your semester. There's plenty of opportunities to improve. So last Thursday, we started talking about the Christian worldview, and particularly that shared grand narrative that unites the Christian worldview, that of creation, fall, and redemption. And we went into talking about the existence of God, whether that is something that is reasonable to believe in. With a lot of things like that, it's nearly impossible to prove something like the existence of God or the non-existence of God 100%. But I think we concluded that it's reasonable. There's good evidence to say something out there exists. But we also talked a little bit about how do we know whether there's one God or millions of gods? And so we talked a little bit about the importance of the Bible, and that's why we spent time talking about the reliability of the Bible. As we think about various worldviews, right, today I want to start off with thinking about various worldviews and their thoughts about God. There are a couple of categories that we can classify worldviews in, especially when you think about God. There are some worldviews that we can classify as theistic. That means they believe there is a God or gods. Right? So theistic views believe there is a God or gods. There is also an atheistic view, which is the belief or the belief that there is no God. Right? So theistic believes in God. Atheistic believes there's no God. Now, with a lot of words, English words that come to us from the Greek, if you add an A in front of it, that usually is the opposite, right? So, God, no God. There is also what we might call agnostic worldviews. Basically, the agnostic believes that you can't really know. There may be a God, there may be no gods, but you can't know. There's not enough information to make a determination one way or the other. So this part here comes from the Greek word for knowledge, right? And so the A there, you can't know. There's no knowledge. It's not necessarily atheistic, right? Because the agnostic says you can't know. So you can't know if there is a God, you can't know if there's not a God. A lot of agnostics tend to lean more towards atheism, but in general, it's not specifically atheistic. Right? They don't specifically believe there is no God. Questions about that? Anything we need to clarify? Go ahead, Ron.
God's standpoint is theistic. Second the Bible, is that good? Like, if you think it's multiple gods, or how would that be?
Yeah, so the term theistic is just the belief that there is a God or gods. Right? And so Christianity would be a theistic religion. But if a religion believed in multiple gods, it would also be a theistic religion. Other questions? All right, so what religions do you know of in the world that are theistic? Right? They believe in God or gods. Right? Christianity. Right? Islam. What else?
Catholics.
Hindus. Somebody said something else? Buddhists. What else? What other religions are theistic? Judaism? What else? What was that? Oh, Catholic. Sorry, having hard to hear. So we'll include Catholicism here with Christianity. I'm sorry. What else? What other religions do you know of that believe in God or multiple gods? What was that? All right, so paganism. Not too many around, but often believe in that. Anything else? All right. Anything else? Probably one that a lot of you have not heard of, but Sikhism would be another one that would fit in there as well. And probably, if we took more time, we could probably come up with some others that would fit in there. So these are all examples of theistic religions. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. We're not going to spend a lot of time under each of these. We'll certainly talk more about Christianity, so we're not going to really spend some time today talking about that. So, Islam. Somebody that practices Islam is known as a Muslim. Right? So Islam is the religion. Muslim is one who practices Islam. Before we get further into this, let's talk a little bit about different types of theisms. Right? There are a couple of different types of theisms. There's monotheism. What is the monotheistic belief about?
There are many gods.
Not this one.
No, many gods.
There's not many gods. There's just one, right? So mono, coming from the Greek, meaning one. So there's one God. Now, the multiple gods, polytheism, right? So poly meaning many, right? So monotheism, there's one God. Polytheism, there's many gods. Now, there's a third term that you may not have heard of before. Henotheism. Henotheism believes that there are many gods, so it's a type of polytheism. But there's one kind of high God. Right? There's kind of a ruler God. And then there are lesser gods. Right? So it's not quite polytheism, but it's polytheistic. Right? So monotheism, one God. Polytheism, many gods. Henotheism, there's one high God. So Islam, right? Out of these, which of those represents Islam? Monotheism. Right, so Islam is a monotheistic religion. Started with a man named Muhammad. The claim is that Muhammad was visited by an angel and was told that he was going to be a prophet of God. The major book of Islam is the Quran. That's their scriptures. And the Quran purports to tell these messages from God. Not a lot. There are several stories from the Bible that are found in the Quran. So there's a close connection between Islam and Christianity and Judaism as far as some of those main stories, some of the main people, those kind of things. How about Hinduism? What do you know about the belief in gods of Hinduism? Most of the time what we think of with Hinduism is that it's polytheistic.
Like animals or something?
Several of them do, some of them are in features of human beings. Others might have, like, for example, one of the most popular gods is a god named Ganesha, which has an elephant head. And always a broken tusk, because he broke his tusk off to write one of their scriptures. So there's polytheism that's in Hinduism. How many gods do Hindus believe in? Well, there's not a clear list. Some will say traditionally it's 303,000. Some have said 300 million. You're not going to find a list anywhere of 330 million gods. However, with Hinduism, there's a lot of diversity, so that there are some forms of Hinduism that are monotheism. And there are some that are basically atheism. They don't believe in a God. You say, okay, well, wait a second. How is it polytheistic, monotheistic, and atheistic? Some of that has to do with the conquest of the British. So the British took over India, and they classified the people and their religious beliefs as Hinduism, connected with the Indus River that kind of runs through India. And so they just lumped a bunch of people together and said, these are Hindu, they practice Hinduism. And so you have some polytheistic versions, some monotheistic versions. Now, atheism. The atheism that I mean here is that there's not a personal being of God, but instead there is a force that kind of permeates all of reality, known as Brahman. And so it's kind of like a force and energy, and that's the true reality. Our experience of reality is actually an illusion. Right? And so how we experience reality is illusion. But each of us is a sliver of Brahman known as Atman. And that's the self. Right? That's what you call yourself, right? But Atman is intimately tied with Brahman, and the illusion is that we are separate from each other. So it's not like a God and then human beings, right? It's like it's all interconnected in this impersonal type of energy or force. Confused yet? No, me too. So there's a lot of diversity in Hinduism. Same thing is true with Buddhism. Right? There are some forms of Buddhism that are essentially atheistic, that they don't believe in a God like what we talk about with God. Right? So when Westerners talk about God, whether they believe in God or not, they mean like some personal being that is separate from the world, separate from the universe. Some types of Buddhism don't believe in that. Right? And they have a similar view, some types of Buddhism have a similar view to what's presented in Hinduism. But there are some types of Buddhism that are polytheistic, that believe in multiple gods. Again, much like Hinduism. Because both Hinduism and Buddhism develop in India. Right? So they develop in a similar place, and Buddhism actually develops out of Hinduism. Judaism. What do you know about Judaism as far as when it comes to God? Monotheistic. Now, Christianity, we would classify as monotheism as well. And we'll explore this further, but in that monotheism of Christianity, there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that God has both a three nature and a one nature, right? God is both one and three. It's very difficult. We'll come to it later. But Islam and Judaism are a very, what we might call, strict monotheism, in the sense that, right, there is one God, and God only has a unity to him. He doesn't have a trinity to him. Not only is Judaism a monotheism, it's what we might call an ethical monotheism. Islam and Christianity would be ethical monotheisms as well. What do you think ethical monotheism means? Any guesses about what ethical monotheism means?
You're proud of doing good. It's based on doing good works.
Okay, so there's an idea of doing good works. And so basically an ethical monotheism is a belief in one God, but that one God has expectations, right, that you're going to do certain good things, right? You're going to act in certain ways. So you're going to act ethically. Not all monotheisms would necessarily be that way. The one God in a particular system may or may not care what human beings do. Right? But the God present in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity is expecting human beings and gives guidance to human beings on how to act properly. Paganism. Today, paganism is a difficult term. It's not very concise. You know, when you talk about Judaism, when you talk about Islam, there's a pretty good idea what you're talking about. Who are the people that are practicing these religions? Paganism, it's a very broad category. It's almost like Hinduism in the sense of, you know, it's a term that's used, but it may not best help us understand. Because in some types of what we would call paganism, you have what we might call a nature spirituality, in the sense that there's kind of an energy or a spirit throughout nature, what's sometimes referred to as pantheism. That the divine is in everything. Some types of paganism, especially what tends to be called witchcraft or Wicca, is what sometimes people refer to as goddess worship, where it's still kind of connected with this nature spirituality, but that there is this feminine deity who is kind of present in everything, gives life to nature, those kind of things. Any questions so far? Anything we need to clarify? Greek mythology, of course, not really, and we can also put like Norse mythology, not really practiced anymore. You might find some people here and there, more so Norse mythology than Greek mythology. But out of our terms, mono, poly, and heno, what type of theisms are these? They're polytheisms. And they are not necessarily ethical polytheisms, right? Because in Greek culture, you didn't worship, or I mean, you worship the gods to try to get them on your side, so you would have good crops, you'd be able to have good, healthy kids, you'd have good fortune in your job. They didn't show you how to live the right ways. Right? You went to philosophy for that, right? And so it's not a system where you would have, those kind of ethical expectations. Sikhism is also a religion that develops in India, and so there are some things with Hinduism and Buddhism that are present in Sikhism as well, but Sikhism is a monotheism. And so they believe in one God. But with that, there are also, like I said, beliefs connected with Buddhism and Hinduism, things like karma. What's karma? Or what have you heard about what karma is?
You do something bad, it's coming back to you.
Yeah, that expectation of your actions have consequences. So if you do good things will come your way. If you do bad things will come your way. Each of these has some slightly different views of karma, but in general, that's the idea. And so you want to do good things, because of, what'll happen as a consequence. So it has to do with actions. There is also the idea of samsara, which is basically the cycle of death and rebirth. Right? Reincarnation is sometimes how it's talked about. So that you live life after life after life. Karma affects that rebirth, right? So if you do good things in this life, you will have good things in the next life. And so a lot of the religions of India kind of have these concepts with them, and don't necessarily, even ones that have deities associated with them, don't have necessarily the idea of a heaven, like you hear of in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Right? That notion of there's an eternal destiny of reward or punishment. What questions do you have? What areas do we need to clarify? We'll come back at the end of the semester and again talk about some of these things, compare them to Christianity, right? And because one of the key things to kind of get in your mind now is that while some people would claim, right, that all these different religions are something like they're all different paths up the same mountain, they're not. They all have different ideas about God. They all have different ideas about the right way to live. They all have different ideas about the ultimate destination of human beings. And so there's some very, very important differences between these religions, and it's important to have that as a understanding. And we'll, again, come back to that toward the end of the semester. All right. So now that we've kind of talked about and said, all right, these are different views about God that exist in society, I want to turn now to thinking about the character of God as presented in the Bible. So for the next couple of classes, we'll talk about God's characteristics. What does the Bible say about God, who he is, what he's like? And I want to start off with sharing some videos. We'll spend some time watching some videos by the Bible Project. The Bible Project produces a lot of videos about biblical topics, overviews of the books of the Bible, concepts, themes, etc. And they have a good, what's the word I'm looking for? Good overview to help us begin to think about some of those concepts. To start with, and so we're going to watch some videos about words associated with God in Exodus chapter 34. So if you'll turn to Exodus chapter 34, this is page 85. And if somebody would read verses 6 and 7. So Exodus 34, 6 and 7, page 85.
The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
Through verse 17.
Keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving
Iniquity.
and transgression and sin, but who will know who is greatly guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the fifth and to the third and fourth generation.
Right, so the context here is God is speaking to a man named Moses, and Moses wants to know about God's character. And so God goes past him and proclaims to him, these things about his character, right? Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and faithfulness. So what we're going to do now is watch these Bible Project videos about this. As we're going through, take notes about the different characteristics, because there will be questions on the next exam coming from these videos, right? So as it goes through these different terms, you'll want to pay attention, have that information in your Bibles for the exam, and to know. I mean, it's important things to know.
Many ancient Israelite scrolls, and together they're telling one unified story.
Now, if you look at the second scroll, Exodus, you'll find two important sentences. They're actually so important that they're referenced and requoted over 20 more times within the Bible itself.
It must be important. What does it say?
Yahweh, Yahweh, that's God's name, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness.
I can see why it's repeated so often. These attributes of God are really lovely.
And the statement goes on. He maintains loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he won't declare innocent the guilty. He will bring the iniquities of the fathers upon the children and grandchildren to the third and the fourth.
Okay, hold on. This last part takes a bit of a turn. We're first talking about God's love, and suddenly it's about his judgment on grandkids. So, is God merciful or vengeful?
Yeah, great question. Let's see these words in a larger context by looking at something important in Genesis, the first scroll of the Bible. There, God chooses one family, the Israelites, from among the nations, and he promises that he's going to rescue the whole world through this family somehow.
And Genesis ends with the family of Abraham in Egypt.
Then the book of Exodus begins, and this book has two large movements.
Right, okay, so this first movement of Exodus, God rescues Israel from slavery in Egypt.
And in the second movement, God leads them to Mount Sinai, where they camp out for a year. And God invites this whole nation into a partnership called a covenant, so that they can be shaped by his values and character.
And represent God to all the other nations.
Exactly. Now, this whole Mount Sinai movement in Exodus can be broken up into four literary units. First, there's the actual ceremony, where the Israelites agree to be God's partners. And God sets up the terms of the relationship, starting with the 10 Commandments. The first two are,
don't give your allegiance to other gods, and don't make any idol images to God. Seems simple enough.
After that, God shows Moses detailed blueprints for building this sacred home so that God can come and live among them.
All right, and then comes a really long narrative about the building of that sacred home.
But you missed something. Right in between these sections is the story that has our description about God's character. The story begins with Moses going up on the mountain, writing down the partner agreement, as the Israelites are at the base of the mountain, violating the first two commands.
That's ridiculous. They're breaking the covenant vows while the ceremony is still going on.
Yes. And so God is hurt and angry, and he warns Moses that this betrayal will keep on happening. God is ready to call it quits.
But what about his promise to rescue the world through them?
Yeah, exactly. This is what Moses brings up. And so, what is God going to do? Should he end the partnership, which would be fair?
Or will he be faithful to his promise to Abraham and show them mercy?
Yeah, exactly. Now, look back at the words that we began with, and you'll see they're about this very tension between God's mercy and his justice.
Okay, so the statement opens like this. A God compassionate and gracious.
In Hebrew, this line has three words that rhyme. El Rahum Dachanun. And the line overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness matches the first, as it also has 3 Hebrew words, Rav Chesed ve'emet.
Each of those lines have 2 attributes of God, and they surround a 5th attribute, that God is slow to anger.
Right. Now, that's the first half of this description of God. Then comes the second half. God maintains loyal love for thousands. And how is he going to remain loyal to people who keep rebelling against him? By forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin.
But God's forgiveness doesn't mean people can just do whatever they want.
Right. God's mercy is balanced in what follows. Yet he won't declare innocent the guilty. He'll bring the iniquities of the fathers upon the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and the 4th.
The 3rd and the 4th, what?
Well, it's referring to generations of people who repeat their ancestors' rebellion against God. They'll get what they deserve. But notice, this small number of generations contrasts that massive number up above.
God's loyal love to thousands.
Right. And then check this out. God's forgiveness of iniquity in this line is contrasted with his justice on iniquity in this line.
Okay, and all those lines are surrounding a central line here about God's justice. He will not declare innocent the guilty. So while God is slow to anger, he is also just.
Right. This is the tension that these 2 sentences are exploring. How does a faithful and loyal God deal with such a rebellious people? This is the challenge God faces in this story, and it's the same challenge he faces in the whole biblical story as he works to rescue the world through this family.
With that in mind, we can take a closer look at these 5 attributes that God declares about himself to Moses. A God compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness.
And we'll see how each one leads us deeper into the character of God and into the story of the Bible.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently described God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. The very first word used in this description of God is compassionate, or in Hebrew, rahum. This word also appears as a noun, rachamim, or compassion. And what's fascinating is that both of these words are related to the Hebrew word for womb, rechem. So compassion in the Hebrew Bible is centered on a person's core, and the word invites us to imagine a mother's tender feelings for her vulnerable infant. So rahum is a word that conveys intense emotion. Sometimes it's even translated as deeply moved, like in the story of King Solomon, who meets 2 women who've just given birth. One of their babies sadly dies, but then both women claim that the baby still living is theirs. As a test, Solomon says to cut the baby in 2 and give each mother a half. And the baby's real mother is deeply moved. She would rather the other woman take her baby than see her child die. And it's her compassion that reveals that she's the true mother. But rahum isn't just an emotional word. It also involves action. And surprisingly, the word is used most often to describe God's actions, motivated by his emotions. Like when the Israelites are suffering and oppressed in Egypt, God hears their cries and is compelled by his compassion, his rachamim, to rescue them. Then, as the Israelites travel through the dangerous wilderness, they're hungry and thirsty, and God is rahum, caring for them as his own child. He provides everything they need: food, water, and clothing, as he personally guides them. So it's no surprise that when Yahweh reveals his character to the Israelites in the wilderness, he begins by saying he's compassionate. But despite Yahweh's continual rachamim, the Israelites turn away from him time and again. They reject Yahweh's compassion and instead give their allegiance to other gods. And rather than showing compassion to each other, they do violence. And their rebellion results in exile, and they're scattered among the nations. And it's in this dark moment in Israel's story that we come to the book of Isaiah, where Yahweh compares himself to a mother full of rachamim toward her baby. He says, "Can a mother forget her nursing child or have no compassion or rachamim on the child of her womb? Even if she forgets, I will not forget you. God is full of motherly compassion, and he will rescue his people. And as you read further in Isaiah, you realize that God is going to do this by entering into the suffering of humanity. And this points forward to a time when Jesus comes on the scene. He is Yahweh's deep compassion become human. In Greek, the word compassion is oiktirnos. And as Jesus embraces the sick and cares for the outcast, he is deeply moved by human suffering. Jesus compares himself to a mother hen using her wings to shield her chicks from danger as he gathers people into his embrace. And in the ultimate expression of oiktirnos, Jesus is moved by compassion to enter into humanity's suffering, into death itself, to rescue and bring us near to God. And it's this same life of compassion that Jesus calls his followers to imitate, allowing ourselves to be moved by the pain of others, to embrace the hurting, and to participate in relieving suffering in the world. In this way, we too can embody the compassion of Yahweh, or in Jesus' words, be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Now you can see how fitting it is that compassionate is the first word God uses to describe himself. So when we're in pain or see others suffering, we can be certain that God is deeply moved to respond, and that he's there to meet us with his deep compassion.
If you try to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faith. We're going to look at the second key word in this statement, gracious. The Hebrew word is chanud, which is related to the Hebrew noun chen. This word chen is often translated as grace or favor. And if you study how this word is used throughout the Bible, you find a fascinating story. One meaning, chen, is delightful or favorable. In the Psalms, a skilled poet is said to have lips of chen. That is, he can craft beautiful words that bring delight. Or a dazzling piece of jewelry is an ornament of chen. It attracts attention and favor. This is why chen is often the word used to describe a gift given with delight or favor. In these cases, chen could be translated as grace. Like in the story of Esther, who approaches the king of Persia to ask that she and her people be spared from death. She calls this a request for chen. And because the king delights in Esther, he favors her and grants her wish. So, giving a gift of favor is chen because it's motivated by delight. And the most extreme kind of chen is showing favor to someone who should get what they deserve, not a generous gift. Like Jacob, who cheated his brother Esau, ran away, and then after 20 years wants to come back and make things right. So he comes to Esau asking, "May I find chen in your eyes?" Jacob isn't asking for what is fair, but for favor. And surprisingly, that's what Esau gives him. He chooses to delight in his brother Jacob and show him grace that he doesn't deserve. Now, chen requires a generous spirit, which people sometimes have. But in the Bible, the one who shows more chen than anyone else is God. Like when God rescued the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and they quickly betray him by giving their allegiance to a golden idol as their God. But then, Moses steps in and asks God to consider giving a gift that they don't deserve. And God says yes, by showing the ultimate act of chen, forgiveness and a promise to be with his people. This character trait of God is so reliable that over 40 times in the book of Psalms, people cry out for God's chen when they're sick or in danger or when the Israelites are in exile. And the biblical prophets like Isaiah looked back to God's chen in the past and boldly declared that God will one day show chen to his people by delivering them and all creation from death and ruin. Now, when we turn to the authors of the New Testament, they describe God's chen with the Greek word charis, which means gracious gift. Like when we're introduced to Jesus in the Gospel of John, we're told that Jesus is God's glorious charis become human, sent into a world of people trapped in darkness and death. Because according to the Apostle Paul, we're like the living dead. God has handed humanity over to the destructive consequences of our selfish decisions. But, Paul says, God is rich in mercy, and by his charis, he's rescued us. He's talking about how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are offered to us as a generous gift of life that is more powerful than death. And as with any gift, all one has to do is receive it. So, now you can see why the biblical authors talk so much about this description of God's character throughout the Bible. When people are willing to own their failures and ask God for chen, he has a consistent and generous response. God gives the gift of himself, his life, and his love. And this is what it means that God is gracious. If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently described God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this third phrase, that God is slow to anger. Now, that might surprise some people. Isn't the God of the Bible mostly angry, striking people down for their sins? Well, it turns out that God's anger in the Bible is way more nuanced than that, and way more interesting. In Hebrew, the phrase slow to anger is pronounced erek apayim, or literally long of nose. But what does God's patience have to do with a long nose? Well, first, we need to look at the common biblical Hebrew way to say that someone is angry. Their nose burned hot. Like in the story of Joseph, when Potiphar thinks that Joseph tried to sleep with his wife, his nose burned hot. It's usually translated, his anger burned. It's describing how your body, especially your face, gets hot when you're filled with anger. And so in Hebrew, the main words for anger are either nose or heat or hot nose. This is why a patient person is called long of nose. It takes a long time for their nose to get hot. Like in the biblical proverb, a person's wisdom is their long nose. That is, their slow anger. Now, in the Bible, God gets angry numerous times, but God doesn't have a nose or get hot. These are metaphors, using our experience of hot anger to describe how God feels when he witnesses human evil. Just like you would get angry if you saw a child being bullied on the playground, so God gets angry when humans oppress each other and ruin his world. In the Bible, God's anger is an expression of his justice and his love for the world. But he's slow to anger, which means he gives people lots of time to change. Like in the story of the Exodus, when Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites and has their baby boys thrown into the waters, God sends Moses to confront Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's given 10 chances to let Israel go free, but after the 10th refusal, Pharaoh rides out with his chariots to destroy the Israelites, and so God destroys him in the waters. Pharaoh's own evil is turned back upon him, and we read that this is an act of God's hot anger. Now, that's really intense, but think about it. God wouldn't be good if he didn't get angry at Pharaoh's evil and eventually do something about it. And notice that God's anger is expressed by handing Pharaoh over to the consequences of his own decisions. And this is actually how God's anger is shown throughout the scriptures. Like in the story of the Israelites. Over and over again, for hundreds of years, they betray the God who rescued them from slavery. And though he gives them many chances to turn around, they keep giving their allegiance to the gods of other nations. And each time we read that the hot anger of God burned against the Israelites. But notice what always follows. God gave them over into the hands of their enemies. Israel wanted to serve the gods of other nations, and so God, in his just anger, gives them what they want, as those nations circle back and defeat Israel. This is similar to what the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Romans. He says God's anger is being revealed against human evil, and then 3 times he says what that looks like. God hands people over to their destructive desires and decisions, even if it leads to death. But Paul also says God is patient. giving people time to come to their senses and change. Because remember, God's anger is a response to human evil, and it's based on a deeper character trait, his compassion and his loyal love. God is not content to let people sit in their own self-destruction. In the Bible, God's on a mission to rescue. This is why Jesus said that he was going to Jerusalem to die, as a demonstration of God's love for his enemies. He would stand in the place of his people who were choosing self-destruction and take the consequences of their decisions on himself. In Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, we see God's anger at evil and his love for people working together to provide forgiveness and life for a humanity lost in self-ruin. So God's anger in the Bible is really important, but it's not the end of the story. When God is angry and brings justice, it's because he's good. And he's extremely patient, working out his plan to restore people to his love. And that's what it means to say that God is slow to anger. If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this fourth phrase, loyal love. It translates the Hebrew word chesed, which is hard to translate into any language because it combines the ideas of love, generosity, and enduring commitment all into one. Chesed describes an act of promise-keeping loyalty that is motivated by deep personal care. Like in the story of Ruth. Ruth is a foreigner married to an Israelite man. But tragically, her husband dies, along with his brother and his father. All Ruth has left is her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, who has nothing to give her. Naomi tells Ruth she should go back to her people, but instead, Ruth promises to stay by Naomi's side and take care of her. And as other people watch Ruth keep this promise over time, they call it an act of chesed. Notice that Ruth's chesed is not conditional or based on Naomi's worth. Rather, it's an expression of Ruth's character. She just is a generous and loving person who keeps her word. That's chesed. Now, Ruth's loyal love is truly inspiring, but the one who shows the most enduring chesed in the Bible is God. Like in the story about Jacob, who is a treacherous liar even to his own family. But despite that, God chooses him and repeats the promise he made to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, that he would have a huge family through whom God would restore his blessings to nations. And so 20 years later, when Jacob realizes how undeserving he is, he says to God, "I'm not worthy of all the chesed you've shown me." And he's right. But God's chesed was never about Jacob's worth in the first place. It's a display of God's generous loyalty to his promise. God's chesed continues into the story of Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. When they're enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt, we're told that God remembered his promise to Abraham and Jacob, so God defeats Egypt and raises up Moses to liberate the people and lead them into the promised land. And in the story, this is called an act of chesed, because it was about God keeping his word. Now, on their way to the promised land, the Israelites are scared of the nations around them, and they doubt that God can protect them. So the people threaten to kill Moses and appoint a new leader to take them back to Egypt. God is understandably hurt and angry, but Moses steps in and says, "Forgive the sin of these people because of your great chesed." Notice that Moses asks God to forgive not because the people deserve it, but because it's consistent with God's own character. And God agrees, and he recommits himself to a people that don't want to be committed to him. In the Bible, God is loyal and loving for no other reason than it's just who God is. Of course, he wants his people to respond with chesed in return, but even when they don't, God's chesed remains. The prophet Hosea compared Israel's chesed to a morning mist that's here one moment, gone the next. But God's chesed is enduring. Like in the celebration of Psalm 136, that opens by saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good," and then 26 times repeats, "His chesed is forever." And so, after centuries of Israel betraying their commitment to God, and after humanity's long history of violence and death, God still kept his promise in a dramatic and drastic way by becoming human and binding himself to us in the person of Jesus. And the people who followed Jesus of Nazareth said that in him they encountered the God of Israel, who is full of loyal love and faithfulness. Jesus is the ultimate loyal and loving hero. And in his life, death, and resurrection, God opened up a new future for all of us and for all of creation. And God did this because it's just who God is: generous, loving, and eternally loyal to his promises. And when we experience the purity and power of God's loyal love shown through Jesus, it compels us to reimagine why and how we can show chesed back to God and to the people around us. This is what it means to say that God is overflowing loyal love.
If you try to describe what God is like, it can be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently described God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this last characteristic of God. It's the Hebrew word emet, which can be translated as faithfulness or even truth. It's related to another word you've probably heard before, amen, which is an untranslated Hebrew expression meaning that's truth. So emet can mean truth, and it can refer to correct ideas or concepts. This is because emet has to do with stability and reliability, like when Moses holds up his hands for hours to defeat Israel's enemies, the Amalekites. His friends put a rock under him and support his hands so that his hands will remain emet, or steady. When emet is used of people, it describes reliable and stable character, or trustworthiness. Like when Moses appoints leaders in Israel, they're to be people of emet, people who are trustworthy, who won't take bribes or distort justice. So to say that God is full of emet doesn't just mean that God tells the truth or stands for truth. It means that God is faithful and trustworthy. This is why Moses calls God a rock, saying that he's faithful, just, and upright. He's saying that he can trust God to be consistent to his character. And the Hebrew word for trust is actually the verb form of the word emet. It's he'emin. It can be translated as to believe or to have faith, but most basically it means to consider someone trustworthy or to trust. The first person we meet in the Bible who considers God to be trustworthy is Abraham. God makes a promise that Abraham and his wife Sarah will have a huge family and that through them, all nations will experience God's blessing. But Abraham and Sarah are really, really old, and they've never been able to have any children. And yet, in the face of these challenges, Abraham means God. He considers God trustworthy to open a way forward. And God does show emet to Abraham and Sarah. In just 4 generations, their descendants form a whole nation called Israel. And God invites Israel into a trusting and faithful relationship. And when God leads them out of slavery in Egypt, Israel means in God. They trust and rely on him. But when they come to the land God promised to Abraham, and they find out it's filled with giant cities protected by giants, their trust in God's emet fails. But eventually we meet an Israelite who does trust God in the face of giants. It's David. He yells at the giant, "You come with a sword and a spear, but I come with the name of the God of Israel." David consistently relies on God. In fact, it said that David walked in emet before God. So David considers God to be faithful and responds with faithfulness. This is why God promises to raise up a faithful descendant of David, whose kingdom will endure forever, or in Hebrew, have emet. This faithful king will become the source of trust and stability for others forever. But when the kingdom later collapses, the Israelites find themselves without a home and without a king. And they cry out, "Oh God, where is your loyal love that you swore to David in your emet?" They're accusing God of abandoning his promises to Abraham and to David. Is God trustworthy? Is he faithful after all? The first line of the New Testament is an answer to that question. This is the lineage of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. In other words, through Jesus, God fulfills his promises. Or as Paul says, Jesus came on behalf of God's faithfulness. He is the faithful king whose kingdom will endure forever and who invites all nations to trust God. Now, trusting anyone is risky. It's hard to know if anyone is really full of emet. But the biblical story portrays a God who's been faithful all along and whose promises were fulfilled in the story of Jesus. And so as we look out at the obstacles facing us and our world, we're invited to take that same risk and join Abraham, David, and the people of God in trusting that God is overflowing with faithfulness.
All right, so those videos cover the 5 characteristics that are presented there in Exodus 34. So in the last few minutes we have, I kind of want to go through them, make sure we're all on the same page. So what did you get out of the videos regarding what the word compassionate means? When it says God is compassionate, what does that mean? All right, so frequently referred to as deeply moved.
Involve your action that's motivated by others.
What's it compared to?
Mother and a child.
All right, mother and a child. So when it says that God is compassionate, the image that's used is how a mother is with a child. Right? There's that tenderness there. And really it talks about God being deeply moved. What's God particularly deeply moved by? Right? Us, suffering, right? Seeing people oppressed, right? Those are the kind of things that deeply move God, right? God is compassionate. What does it mean that God is gracious? All right, so another word that's kind of used there is favor. And I should say, by the way, that you don't need to know any of the Hebrew or Greek words they talked about in the video, so you don't need to worry about that. What does it mean to give favor to somebody? All right, so there's that idea of it being something that's undeserved. And that what's deserved is, right, something different than a generous gift. Right, so the idea is that God is a generous giver. But what's the attitude that's connected with God being gracious? It says God gives gifts with delight. So it's not a grudging giving of a gift. Right? There's delight. God delights to give favor. God delights to be compassionate. What does it mean to be slow to anger? What's the Hebrew phrase that they use? Not the Hebrew word, but long of nose. Right? So anger, I heard somebody say about, the anger usually translates a phrase meaning hot nose, right? Having a hot nose. Being slow to anger means long of nose. Right? That kind of goes back to some of our discussion with translations, right? I mean, if you were reading along and it said God is long of nose, which would be a literal translation of that phrase, you're like, what? Right? God has a big nose? Right? So, slow to anger expresses that. What else Why does God get angry? Okay, right? Specifically when there's injustice. But God is slow to anger. When somebody does something unjust or evil, he doesn't immediately get angry and punish. Instead, he's gracious and compassionate, gives people the time to change. What about loyal love? What are some of the things connected with loyal love?
He gives us chance after chance.
All right? Giving chances.
Even when people don't give it in return, he remains.
Right? Right? Even if people do not express loyal love in return, God remains as someone that expresses loyal love. I mean, how easy is it to express love to somebody that doesn't return that to you or acts completely contrast to that love? They also describe it as having an enduring commitment. And speaks of God's loyalty to his promises. If God promises to do something, he's going to fulfill that. He's going to stay loyal to that. And then faithfulness. What were some of the things that came out about faithfulness? All right? That idea of remaining true. With that is an idea of stability. And there's a stability to God. What else?